Hi, everyone. My name is Adrian. Thank you so much for joining us today. Just by way of introduction, I am part of the executive committee of the Singapore FinTech Association. And, in my day job, I look after the FinTech practice as well as the ESG and ESG practice within our law firm, Allen and Gladhill. I also cover financial regulatory issues. We thought about what's been going on in Singapore and around the world, and you look at headlines such as Shopee, for example, retrenching people. You look at news reports about fintech giants like Coinbase freezing their employment of new people. And you also read reports about insolvency related issues. So, for example, you've got I'm sure most of you have heard of Three Arrows and the problems that they are facing right now. You might have heard of Whole who were given the in-principle approval from MAS for their cryptocurrency license, but this has since been withdrawn. And of course, you no doubt have heard about Terra USD and Luna, and that coin basically dropping down to zero value, and their founder being a fugitive that's wanted by the South Korean authorities. So, oh yes, and also, of course, to add to the gloom, we read reports about private equity and venture capital companies reducing their investment in tech companies. And I suppose all this has a filter effect. So we thought very long and hard about how we can, share information and bring value to the SFA and its members. And this was how this 3-seminar series was essentially conceived. The way we split the seminar, we've got the first seminar that deals with employment-related issues, specifically retrenchment issues. We've got the second seminar that deals with insolvency-related issues, and that will be from the perspective of firms that may be going into insolvency, as well as firms that are facing counterparties that are insolvent or are going into insolvency. And with all this conflict, we thought that for the third seminar, instead of talking about your standard litigation, we would introduce the Singapore International Mediation Center, which is the fairly new center for mediation, which can serve as an alternative venue for dispute resolution. So, with these 3 seminars, I'm very pleased to have very prominent people to speak to us today about these topics. Employment will be handled by my colleague at Allen and Gladhill, Yo Boon Kiet. And Boon Kiet is a specialist in employment law as well as projects and infrastructure. He's been mentioned in the Legal 500 as one of the up and coming partners. So I'm very excited to see what he has to say. The next session in the afternoon will be held by another colleague from the law firm that I work at, and his name is Alex Yo. Alex is very familiar with insolvency related issues, and it's currently representing a number of clients in relation to such issues. And at the end, tomorrow's session, we've got Bennett Tan from the registrar of the Singapore International Mediation Center to do his segment and give us an introduction about what the SIMC can do. So the way the format is going to work for all 3 sessions, Boon Kiet will basically run us through his talk. And if you have any questions, please put it in the chat box. At the end of the session, we'll read the chat box and we'll take questions. We'll answer questions that have been listed there. And of course, at the end, if you have any other questions that come to mind, please feel free to voice them as well. Okay, without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce Boon Kiet. Please, Boon Kiet.
Thanks, Adrian. Good morning, everyone. So it's very nice to be able to be here to share discussions and my thoughts on managing excess manpower in Singapore with everyone. As Adrian mentioned, It is an opportune time to speak about this topic. In 2020, 2021, especially in the fintech sector, we saw a lot of growth and investments into the fintech industry, and also a lot of companies hiring very aggressively. But in the latter part of 2021 and this year as well, we have seen a lot more downsizing, restructuring, reorganizations taking place within organizations, both in the fintech sector and outside, and consequential labor cuts that arise from these restructurings and reorganizations. Partly due to companies looking at the difference in business strategy coming out of the COVID-19 situation, but also tied to that shift to remote working, streamlining of processes, and generally direction of the industries moving towards looking at generally reorganizing. So we thought it would be helpful to have a session on the management of excess manpower with a focus on retrenchment. Just give me a second while I share my screen. I think that hasn't been done yet. So, yeah. Right. Okay. So what I'll run through today would be just a brief overview on the regulatory framework in relation to the conduct of managing excess manpower retrenchment in Singapore. I won't focus too much on that legal aspect. Then we'll talk about the key legal consideration, the processes to bear in mind in relation to the conduct of retrenchment exercises in Singapore, highlight the practical steps, best practices that employers in Singapore should be looking to adopt if they are considering implementing a retrenchment exercise, and the key concerns that may arise in the implementation of the exercise. The idea of the session really is to provide and discuss brief, broad principles so as to guide the thinking and conduct of exercises. So I expect that there would be a number of questions that arise, experiences or things that you've seen before. So as Adrian mentioned, feel free to raise these questions in the chat. I will address them at appropriate junctures during the presentation, or at the end of the presentation, there'll be time for Q&A as well. Okay. So in terms of the regulatory framework in Singapore, the first concern or question to ask really is what constitutes a retrenchment or redundancy. This term, unfortunately, is not defined in law. It's not a term or clear definition that we can find in a statute, and it's something that needs to be determined based on the facts of the situation. So that presents an element of uncertainty. It's a question to consider in each termination of employment, whether or not that employee's employment has been sort of retrenched. And this is something that the MOM has provided some guidance by way of its advisories and guidelines that it has published. So generally, it is regarded as a retrenchment if the termination of employment arises because of a redundancy situation, the role is made obsolete, or reorganization of the structure, the business structure of the employer's organization, such that that role has been sort of changed, merged, it no longer exists in that same form. The other thing to consider would be that if the employment of the employee has been terminated and that role it's not exactly been made obsolete, but there's no intention to fill that vacancy, the starting presumption that MOM will have is that the employer has retrenched the employee. So why are we drilling down into this legal concept of retrenchment, and why is it important? The reason for it is that a retrenchment brings with it certain additional considerations. The question being retrenchment benefits, how do we treat the employee in the event of a retrenchment? What are the concerns with a retrenchment? And we'll explore them further during this session. I would also highlight in particular that Retrenchment can arise from any termination of employment. So even where the parties agree mutually, say, to end the employment, it's a mutual agreement, if factually after that cessation of employment, that role ceases to exist, it's obsolete. Notwithstanding that it's a mutual cessation arrangement or mutual separation agreement, it could still constitute a retrenchment for purposes of Singapore law. Okay, so now then we talk about why this is important. Why do we want to drill down on retrenchment? First, as I mentioned earlier, retrenchment benefits. It is interesting to note that there are actually no mandatory retrenchment benefits in Singapore. There's no statutory requirement for employers to provide retrenchment or severance benefits in Singapore, or give a justification or validate why it conducts a retrenchment exercise. The MOM leaves it generally to an employer to manage its own business strategy and structure. So employers are free to carry out these arrangements. So what I've highlighted is a particular section in the Employment Act that makes reference to retrenchment benefits. And this section is sometimes misleading because it specifically states that, and this two parts here. One is that it covers Part 4 of the Employment Act, which only applies to a limited group of employees, workmen, those engaged in manual labor, who are in receipt of a salary not exceeding 4,500 Singapore dollars a month, and employees who are not workmen and not professionals, managers, or executives who receive a salary not exceeding 2,600 Singapore dollars a month. So it's a very limited group, more of the rank and file employers that it's looking to protect. That's one. And the second is, as you can see from the slides, what it states is that no employee who has been in continuous service for less than 2 years is entitled to any retrenchment benefit. So the way it's phrased is not so much that the employee is entitled if they have served for 2 years, but rather that an employee who has served for less than 2 years is not entitled to a retrenchment benefit. So it's not a positive obligation for an employer to give benefits, but rather it allows the employer to say that an employee who has served less than 2 years and is covered under Part 4 is not entitled to a retrenchment benefit. So just wanted to hold that thought on the regulatory framework. The other legal requirement that needs to be taken into account under the regulatory framework is that there's a need to notify MOM of any retrenchment. So that's why it's important to identify where the employer has carried out a retrenchment so that the employer does not inadvertently fall foul of the notification requirement and attract penalties or scrutiny from the MOM. So the requirements, as you can see on screen, generally applies to most employers as long as you have more than at least 10 employees. And there's a timeline to notify the ministry and certain information to be submitted, which includes who are the employees who are affected and what has been provided to the employees in connection with the retrenchment of the employee. So this is just something, again, to bear in mind. The last point on the regulatory framework, which strictly speaking is not law, is something which I refer to as soft laws. Advisories and guidelines put in place by the Ministry of Manpower, the regulator, to guide employers on good practices that they are encouraged to take into account when conducting retrenchment exercises, managing excess manpower. So these are not strictly legal obligations, but because these are guidelines published by the regulator, the employers are encouraged to take them into account when carrying out retrenchment exercises. And as a matter of practice, most employers in Singapore would adhere to these guidelines. The reason why this is structured is a bit of history. The government in Singapore generally tries to regulate retrenchment and other manpower-related issues through advisories instead of statutes so as to allow flexibility. So it benefits both the employer and employees. The concern really is that having a mandated retrenchment benefit then makes it too inflexible. It then becomes the norm for applying benefits and may not benefit workers and employees in all cases if they're able to provide, say, higher amounts or different levels of severance. And in the same vein, having it as a fixed amount may also burden employers, especially where the financial situation is bad and there's a downsizing because of difficult conditions. So with that in mind, the general suggestion is to take these into account. And if a company does not follow or is not able to adhere to the advisory in carrying out retrenchment, it has to be prepared to objectively explain to the MOM, if the MOM asks questions, why it was it was considered but not adhered to. So at least we can satisfy the MOM that this is a point that company had considered, but because of the financial situation or certain commercial reasons, company was not able to observe these guidelines. The Advisory on Managing Excess Manpower broadly sets out arrangements by which companies can consider prior to implementing a retrenchment exercise. I'll touch on that in the later slides, as well as the suggested amounts as to retrenchment benefits if a retrenchment benefit is to be provided. The guidelines on mandatory retrenchment notifications broadly set out the process by which notifications are to be made to the MOM and the information to be provided. So it's more procedural. Okay. So then we talk about what needs to be considered when or before conducting a retrenchment exercise. Starting point to note is that the advisory provides that retrenchment should be only used as a last resort. So employers are encouraged to consider alternative options. So for companies that had faced manpower issues during the COVID-19 situation, this is something that would be familiar, which is that general policy from MOM would be, as far as possible, try and preserve the jobs. Look at grants, look at financial support, look at other cost-saving measures that can be implemented before retrenching employees. So the types of cost-saving measures that have been suggested by the advisories will cover generally adjustments, redeployment of employees to other roles, or training, upskilling the employees to other roles within the organization, allowing for flexible work arrangements so as not to overburden the organization if there are financial difficulties. Of course, the same level of adjustments can also be done with wage cuts, having part-time work, employees sharing jobs with dual roles, and having shorter work weeks. Other matters I can consider, other options would be reduction of wages, reducing, say, variable bonus, variable components, annual wage supplements, if any, employment benefits. So that can be adjusted as well, or placing the employer on no pay leave if the employer takes the view that the situation is a temporary one and will improve in the future, and there is a need for the manpower in the future. The one point to highlight would be that if the last three bullet points, wage cuts, direct adjustment to wages or no pay leave, is contemplated, and this results in wage reductions to employees who are working on a work pass in Singapore, then generally MOM approval will be required in advance of the changes in the wages. Reason being that the work passes are tied to the salary of the employee, so any changes to those may impact the eligibility for work passes. So that's just something to bear in mind. In implementing any alternative cost-saving measures, and also in selecting who is affected by these measures. Okay. So assuming that the company has considered and is looking to implement a retrenchment exercise, starting point to consider is that the company, the employer, should follow the tripartite advisory as closely as possible. If not, then be prepared to justify the rationale reason why it did not or was unable to comply. The steps that are, well, the key steps in implementing or conducting any retrenchment exercise would be, broadly as on the screen, identify the employees, determine what needs to be paid to the employees, and let the employees know. Very straightforward, common sense steps, but again, there are a lot of situations where these steps could potentially trip up the employer and lead to claims, questions from the ministry, or undesired public exposure in relation to the conduct of the exercise. So on the first point, in identifying affected employees, the advisory suggests that the identification of employees is based on objective criteria and non-discriminatory. So it has to be, or it should be, tied to criteria relating to how the employee can support the company's business plan and growth for the future. And it shouldn't be based on more subjective grounds that the employer may feel discriminated against. So the key takeaway here is that the employer will need to be able to objectively justify why a particular employee was identified as being affected by the redundancy. So the approach in relation to the conduct of the redundancy would really be to try and safeguard against the potential risk that an employer may face in carrying out the redundancy exercise. And one of these risks would be that a claim is made to the Ministry of Manpower and MOM then investigates. So in this regard, the employer will then need to be able to show to MOM that they had considered all employees who will potentially be affected and chosen the employees on a very fair and consistent or objective manner. An example would be, say, there is a team of 10 employees, and that role needs, or that team, because of business requirements, needs to be downsized by 3. So that example is quite straightforward. And if all 10 employees are engaged in the same role, then it's a matter of considering all 10 employees and determining out of the 10 employees which of the 3, based on objective criteria, would be or should be affected by the retrenchment exercise. Now, the situation gets a bit more complicated if, for example, within that role, that team of 10 employees, maybe 5 of the employees only are engaged in that particular role that is being affected, in which case the assessment should only be limited to the 5 employees rather than all 10 employees. Other permutations that we will see would be where employees actually are cross-deployed because the employee may not be serving a dedicated function, and the function that the employees are supporting, some of these functions are affected by the redundancy. So there are supporting roles such as HR, finance, accounts. So the question then is, how do we then determine who should be affected employees? An example of that is that same team of 10 employees, say HR, and they support multiple functions, multiple departments. However, one of the departments that they're supporting, the whole department is being made redundant. So in that scenario, if we have that team of 10 HR staff, the question then is, how do we identify who is affected? The assessment will have to be made as to whether there would be any reduction in headcount because of the elimination of the department that they are supporting. And if so, what is the role that is being eliminated or affected? And then once we have that number, we can then determine which pool of employees we should be doing an assessment for to identify who is affected. This should all be documented internally by the employer so that they can fulfill that requirement of justifying that basis for selection. It does not need to be made known to the employee, but it does have to be recorded so that the company is able to evidence how it has made the determination. The other point to highlight in terms of identifying employees is that sometimes we have seen employers may have, because of working with a particular group of employees or because of future business needs, they may assess that a particular employee has potential, but unfortunately the employee's role, the entire role, or rather the employee happens to sit in a team that is being made redundant. And if the whole team is being made redundant, then unfortunately the employee would also be made redundant. It would not be possible to sort of swap that employee for another employee in a team that is not being made redundant. What I mean is that if you have an employee from team A and an employee from team B, the team A is being made redundant, but team B is not, then it will not be possible to say we will start looking at employees in team B to make them redundant, especially if the roles are unrelated. The situation would be different if we are looking to redeploy or repurpose the employee from team A that we like into Team B and without affecting any of the employees in Team B. So what I mentioned earlier as to redeployment before implementing a retrenchment exercise. So I've touched on a couple of examples and cases here in relation to identification, just to give a flavor of how this simple step could potentially get a little bit complicated in implementation. But again, really just to give you a sense as to the issues that need to and principles that need to be considered in identifying employees who are affected. The next point then is, after identifying this pool of affected employees, how do we proceed to implement the redundancy exercise? First thing is to ensure what needs to be provided to the employees in relation to the termination of employment and the provision of any benefits in connection with the termination. As mentioned earlier, there's no statutory obligation for employers to pay any severance or retrenchment benefits. Any such benefits, if payable, would need to be contractual in nature, either in the terms of employment, any policies that the company has in place that are incorporated into the terms, any collective agreement if the company recognizes a trade union and the employees are part of the union, and even if there are any common practices that the company engages in. So even though it's not in the terms of employment, if as a matter of common practice, the company provides these benefits, arguably these also form part of the benefits entitlements of the employee on the termination of employment. So it's important to ascertain these so as to again minimize that risk of claim from the employee that the employee was not paid all amounts that were due to the employee on the termination of employment. So as part of this assessment, the company should consider if there are any retrenchment or severance benefits to be provided. This helps to guide how the retrenchment will be carried out, whether it's a unilateral notice of termination or if additional severance benefits are to be given, whether it can be by way of mutual cessation, where the company imposes additional undertakings on the employee in consideration of the additional benefits to be provided. Other things that may be provided in connection with the exercise could be outplacement or employment facilitation services, helping to source for new employers, providing letters of recommendation or endorsement. So these are additional things that can be considered, depending again on the circumstances. I'll just touch briefly on the suggested retrenchment benefits under advisory. So under the advisory, the suggested approach is that employees with 2 or more years of service, the employer can consider providing 2 weeks to 1 month of salary per year of service. Of course, this is subject to the company's financial position, taking into consideration the industry norms. So what that means is that, again, this is something that the company will need to consider if they are looking to provide retrenchment benefits, how the benefits should be computed. If it's computed in a certain way, there should be a consistency applied throughout the board. So as an example, if the company says it will be 1 month of salary per year of service, and we have employees who range from 2 years of service all the way until 20 years of service, the question to consider also would be, would it be that we'll be providing, applying this 1 month throughout, or if there should be any caps on the amount? Are we looking really to provide 20 months of service or 20 months of a retrenchment benefit to the long-serving employee? So the company may consider imposing as a matter of policy certain flaws and ceilings in relation to the retrenchment benefit. But again, this has to be applied for all consistently throughout for that same exercise. Similarly, for that same exercise, the company should also be looking to apply a similar formula for calculating the benefit. If the determination is 1 month of salary per year of service, then the company shouldn't be saying, oh, because this employee may have 30 years of service and 30 months is quite a lot, I shall just pay 1 week per year of service. So there has to be a consistent approach that's adopted in computing or determining these benefits as well. Okay, the next one is in terms of communications and notification. So this is more of a soft element as to how to inform the employees. From the legal perspective, what needs to be done is that notice of termination, notice of the retrenchment needs to be given to the employee. So what's on this slide would be more of not so much legal concerns, but practical points that would help to manage or mitigate the risk of any claim or unhappy employees. And I'll touch why that's a concern later on. So what's important here really is for employers in conducting a retrenchment exercise to control the narrative, control the communication flow and information flow. In terms of how this can be done, usually for the retrenchment exercise, it's a top-down approach. The management or HR will first determine that there will be an exercise to take place and who would be brought in to be aware of the exercise and identify the affected employees. So it's the pool of people who know about it and the information would grow over time. So at some point, the company, the employer would need to consider informing or notifying the employees of the fact that there's a retrenchment exercise. It then becomes a question of how the notification is to be made, whether it is made as a town hall session to all employees, whether it is made in select groups, department level. These are all options that the company can consider, again, depending on size of organization, departments, and the nature of the redundancy exercise, who's affected. But what's important is that the narrative, the communications to employees will need to be consistent throughout. How this can be managed is by way of having talking points, FAQs for the management staff, the line managers who will be responsible for the communication, so that there is a unified message provided by the company to the employees who are affected. This helps to prevent rumors, speculation, uncertainty of what's going to happen to other employees. It's important to manage that because employees do need that level of certainty, especially when there's a retrenchment, potential loss of job, as to how soon will it be before they realize or they are notified who is affected, and what is the potential impact of the exercise. The reason for that is, and this is also important, also not only for the affected employees, but for unaffected employees, because unaffected employees will need to be told that they are not affected, but because of the restructuring, it may affect their jobs. There may be merging of certain roles, there may be additional obligations, and the company may require or may want to incentivize employees to prevent them from being too concerned and leaving the organization because of the exercise. So these are additional considerations relating to communication to the employees that need to be done. Other points to note would be that if the company is unionized, then the company should have discussions with the union as a matter of courtesy, or if there's a collective agreement as a matter of requirements or obligations under the collective agreement. It's also useful to put in place certain FAQs so that the line managers have that consistent messaging to employees who may have questions relating to the retrenchment exercise, as to benefits, the kind of support services that may be provided, options available to employees if they are looking for, say, early departure, extension of the notice period, especially for foreign employees. So the general takeaway here is that employers should try to be more flexible, sensitive to the needs of employees, but balance that with ensuring that there's fair and consistent treatment for employees. So employees may come back and ask for additional benefits, more retrenchment sums, and that's something that the company must be mindful of to ensure that it's not a matter of just because an employee asks for it, then we'll provide the additional benefits, because that approach needs to be carried out fairly and consistently throughout the organization. Same thing for any other accommodation or benefit that may need to be done for any employee that asks for additional assistance. Okay. Right, so going back to the legal aspect of things for a while, why are we looking to run through all these concerns relating to a retrenchment exercise or conduct of a redundancy exercise? The key concerns as flashed on screen are the ones that could trip out employers lead to potential claims against the employer that would lead to monetary loss, costs and expenses scrutiny from the Ministry of Manpower. So the first one we see is one of misclassification, where a retrenchment is not called a retrenchment, where a retrenchment takes place, but the employer does not recognize it as a retrenchment. Or if there is a termination of employment, but the employer tries to classify it as a retrenchment. So in the first instance, if a retrenchment takes place, but the employer doesn't classify it or chooses not to view it as a retrenchment, then that may potentially give rise to one, lack of giving the relevant notification to MOM, for which there are potential penalties. And two, the employee, if the employee is aware that his role is made redundant, then he may come back to ask for retrenchment benefits and ask for alternative cost-saving measures, other support from the company in relation to the termination. The second scenario is that if, as part of a termination exercise, sometimes we see that employers are looking to manage their manpower and sort of push some employees into termination as part of the exercise where their roles are not strictly made redundant. So in that scenario, we run into issues of fair treatment, consistent treatment, and these employees who are sort of folded in, if subsequently they realize that their role actually exists and then their role still exists and the company actually hires people to replace them in that role, then they may come back and raise claims as to unfair dismissal, wrongful dismissal, which is the next point, and argue for additional contractual entitlements in relation for the termination. In the second point on wrongful dismissal, this goes back as to the grounds on which the termination is being made. So generally in the retrenchment, the employer should make it clear that the termination arises because of a redundancy or obsolescence of the role. It shouldn't be that the employer shouldn't be giving any other grounds for termination, sort of citing performance, conduct of the employee. The concern with that is where grounds are given for termination, these grounds can always be challenged. So if additional grounds or wrong grounds are given, the employee may come back and say, actually, these grounds are not correct, and the company shouldn't be terminating my employment. I should be reinstated in employment or given certain payouts in relation to the dismissal. So that is potential concern that may arise in relation to providing employees with too much justification in connection with the termination. The third point would be salary-related claims. This one is fairly straightforward. As long as we ensure all payments are made to the employee, this risk can be mitigated. But in the same vein as well, it's important to carry out that due diligence on the terms of employment to determine all of these contractual entitlements due to employees on termination. Where we see potential issues or concerns usually relate to employee incentive plan, share option plans, things that are not part of the actual terms of employment but ancillary to or benefits that are in policies. Reason being that in most cases, employers just look at the terms of employment, the employment contract, and the policies, the handbook. They may not look at past practices or share option plans. So again, a fairly simple issue to address, but that due diligence process needs to be carried out. And finally, this is a matter of claims for discriminatory practices. Strictly speaking, not a legal one, because there is no specific law against discriminatory practices in Singapore, but there are other sort of agencies, such as the Tripartite Alliance of Fair Employment Practices, and also dispute management, Tripartite Alliance on Dispute Management, that would look into discriminatory practices of employers to see that employees are not treated unfairly in a retrenchment. The potential ramifications of employer engaging in discriminatory practices, especially for foreign employees, would be that MOM could potentially impose additional scrutiny, sanctions on the work part and revocation of work pass privileges, which makes it difficult for many companies to conduct business in Singapore if they have a cap or limits placed on their foreign employment recruitment. I'll also highlight the last bullet point, which is that for certain employees, there are certain statutory protections that apply. Employees who reach a certain age, the age of 63, there are retirement re-employment protections. Female employees who are pregnant have also certain protections relating to their maternity leave benefits. So these are just things to bear in mind in relation to the termination of employment generally. Other points to consider would be the softer matters where, depending on how the retrenchment exercise is conducted, then if there are complaints, whether rightful or wrong, that may affect the reputation of the employer as an employer of choice. So it affects future recruitment, future recruitment for the company. And also, social media nowadays is very prevalent. Well, you have Glassdoor, you have LinkedIn. So employees are not shy, we see, about going to social media. In the past, there was more of the conventional media, newspapers and all. But now it's very easy for an employee to raise a complaint, not to an authority, but to the world at large. And steps will then need to be taken to manage that claim or that issue arising from the employee. And that leads to the third point, which is that whether or not an employee has a justified claim, the commercial consideration where it goes to social media, where it goes to the public, is that the company will need to spend time and resources to address that issue. If it goes to, say, the MOM Employment Claims Tribunal, the company will need to spend time to look into the matter, resources, need to send personnel down to actually attend the session and talk through, even if the claim is eventually decided to be frivolous and thrown out. So these are matters that the company want to manage in step 3 of what I mentioned earlier, which is in communicating to employees and managing the situation early on and controlling that narrative. That will help to mitigate aggrieved employees, employees looking to complain to either social media or the ministry, and try and minimize that risk of the employer having to deal with fallout after conducting the exercise. It's not possible to eliminate this risk entirely, but as far as possible, employers can, by carrying out or having proper considerations in the implementation, mitigate or minimize those risks as far as possible. To end off, I just wanted to touch on some key concerns, or rather a case study that you may have seen in the news earlier this year. So this one is in the news, so this is just a snapshot from the Straits Times article. And the key facts really is that a retrenched employee is looking to sue the company for a certain amount attributable to loss in income and lack of the proper severance package in connection with the retrenchment. The reason for this is that the employer alleges that there were these other roles with the company that the business was transferred to that he was not considered for. And therefore, if he had been considered fairly for that role, he would have been employed in that role and would have been entitled to certain income amounts, during that period that he had otherwise been terminated in respect of. The other allegement for the shortfall is that he was not treated fairly and didn't get the same kind of retrenchment benefits or the same formula as other employees who are affected. So again, this is still in progress. It's all alleged claims, and of course the company also says differently. So what we want to focus on really would be the main takeaways from this. It just demonstrates the importance of communication and managing that narrative in carrying out the exercise and ensuring that employees feel that they are treated fairly, that they all have an equal opportunity. Either everyone's considered for roles, or no one is considered for roles, or if only some people are considered for alternative roles, right, then must be made clear why other people are not, because of particular skill set, because of certain requirements of the business. But this needs to be clearly communicated to all employees and any concerns addressed at the outset, so that it doesn't come back and blow up after the exercise. Second one also would be to, as a general principle, treat all employees fairly and consistently. So apart from applying for roles, it's also ensuring that the benefits are applied fairly across the board, or if there's any deviation, it will need to be justified, not to the employee, but internally. And this brings me to the last point, which is that for all matters, because we are aware that operationally, sometimes a lot of these things are desktop exercises on the back end. It is important to have in place all these internal records as to how the decisions were made, as to why certain departments are affected, why others are not, why certain employees are affected, why others are not. The idea really is to build that case early to ensure that we have that information at hand if there are any questions or queries that are being raised. And also on the point on treating employees fairly, that also helps to address any risk of social media complaints. Because if there is a social media complaint and the employee states that this is how he was treated, assuming that the employee reports the facts, completely, then any third-party observer should be able to see that generally this employee was treated fairly, and he's just being, difficult. So again, the company just has to consider when carrying out the exercise to manage this whole situation in a very objective manner, with the view that even though everything can be done internally and kept under wraps as far as possible, if the whole thing blows up and it's made public, the company is able to justify why it had taken certain steps. Okay, so that brings me to the end of my part of the session. Are there any questions? I noticed that the chat right now is still empty, but I think we do have some time to take questions, about 10-15 minutes or so.
Okay, does anyone have any questions? No, then Boon Kiat, thank you so much for your time and for sharing this information. I hope that the participants today will be able to join us for our afternoon session today, which will be on insolvency, and then thereafter the next day on the SIMC. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Bye.